The automatic door slid open with a soft hydraulic hiss, and every head in the emergency room turned toward the sound of my name being called over the intercom, a name my parents hadn't spoken in 5 years, not since the night they decided I was no longer their daughter, and yet here I was, walking toward the only person who had destroyed my life, and the only person I could save. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 32 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I became the only lifeline for the sister who lied and cost me everything. But to understand why my mother's hand started shaking the moment she saw the name stitched on my white coat, you need to go back to the night it all began, because nothing about that moment in the hospital made sense unless you knew what Olivia did, and what my parents chose to believe. 5 years earlier, it was just another quiet Tuesday night in our house in Hartford, Connecticut, the kind of night where everything looked normal from the outside: dinner plates stacked in the sink, the low hum of the dishwasher, my father sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone like he always did, and my sister Olivia standing by the counter with that perfect smile she had mastered over the years, the kind that made everyone else look slightly less than. And I remember thinking just for a second that maybe things were finally shifting, because for the first time in my life, I had something they couldn't ignore. I had just been accepted into one of the top medical programs in the country, and earlier that evening my dad had looked at me and said, "Maybe you'll actually make something of yourself," which wasn't exactly praise, but it was the closest I had ever gotten, and I held on to that sentence like it meant more than it did, like it was proof that I mattered even a little. Olivia hugged me that night, tighter than usual, asked questions about my classes, my schedule, my future, and I remember thinking maybe she's proud of me, maybe she finally sees me, and that was my first mistake, because what I didn't realize then was that Olivia never asked questions unless she was collecting something she could use later. And 3 days after that dinner, my phone rang at exactly 11:07 p.m. I remember the time because I stared at it afterward, trying to understand how everything could fall apart in less than 4 minutes. It was my father, his voice cold, distant, nothing like the man who had spoken to me just days before. "Your sister told us everything," he said, and before I could even ask what he meant, he continued, "The truth about you dropping out, about the lies, about everything you've been hiding." And I felt the floor tilt under me, because none of it was real, none of it had happened. I tried to explain, tried to tell him where I actually was, what I was actually doing, but it didn't matter, because Olivia had already given them what they needed: proof, screenshots, a story that made sense in a way the truth never could. And in that moment I realized something I should have understood years earlier. It was never about what was true, it was about who they chose to believe. I called back, I sent messages, I even drove home the next morning thinking if they just looked at me, really looked at me, they would see it, but the door stayed closed, my number was blocked, my emails unanswered, and just like that, I went from being their daughter to being no one, erased so completely it was like I had never existed in that house at all. And for the next 5 years I built a life without them, a life where I didn't wait for their approval, didn't expect their calls, didn't hope they would change. But what I didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the story Olivia told was going to circle back in the one place none of us could control. And the moment it did, everything they believed about me would collapse in front of them, because 5 years later, when those emergency room doors opened and my name echoed through that hallway, I wasn't the girl they had cut off anymore. I was the only person standing between Olivia and the consequences of her own lie. And they had no idea what that was going to cost them. I stood there outside that front door for almost 3 minutes, staring at the brass handle like it belonged to someone else's house, even though I had grown up turning it every single day for 18 years, and when I finally knocked, it was not loud, not desperate, just enough to say I am here, just enough to give them a chance to open it, because part of me still believed this was all a misunderstanding, that once they saw me standing there, breathing, real, everything Olivia said would fall apart. But the door did not open right away, and when it finally did, it was my mother, her face already set in that expression I had only ever seen once before, when she talked about neighbors who had embarrassed themselves in public, disappointment mixed with something colder, something final, and she did not step aside to let me in. She just stood there and said my name like it was something unfamiliar, like she was testing how it sounded after not saying it for a while, "Emily." And I remember how small that one word made me feel, how it erased every version of myself I thought I had become. I tried to explain, I told her everything, where I had been, what actually happened, the truth that Olivia had twisted into something unrecognizable. I even offered to show her messages, emails, anything that could prove it, but she did not look at my phone, she did not ask questions, she just shook her head slowly like she had already decided, like the verdict had been reached before I even arrived. And then my father appeared behind her, arms crossed, silent at first, and when he finally spoke, it was not loud, not angry, just controlled in a way that made it worse. "We saw the proof," he said, and those 4 words landed heavier than anything Olivia could have said, because they meant there was nothing I could do, nothing I could show them that would matter. I kept talking anyway because I did not know how to stop, because if I stopped it would mean accepting that this was real, that I was losing them in real time, and I was not ready for that, not yet. But then my father did something small, something almost invisible. He stepped back and closed the door just a few inches, not enough to shut me out completely, but enough to make it clear I was no longer welcome inside. And in that moment I understood something I had never fully allowed myself to see. This was not about one lie, this was about years of choosing Olivia over me, years of believing her version of the story because it fit the role they had already assigned me, the quiet one, the invisible one, the one who could disappoint them without it feeling like a surprise. And suddenly everything made sense in a way that hurt more than the lie itself. I was not being judged for what Olivia said, I was being judged for who they believed I was. I left that night. Without stepping inside, I sat in my car at the end of the driveway with my hands on the steering wheel, watching the porch light flicker through the windshield, waiting for someone to come out to call my name, to say they made a mistake, but no one did. And after 10 minutes, then 20, then 40, I started the engine and drove away. And that was the moment everything shifted, not because I stopped loving them, but because I realized they had already stopped choosing me a long time ago. I just had not noticed until now, and over the next few weeks the silence became permanent. My number stayed blocked, my emails unanswered, even extended family stopped replying, as if the story Olivia told had spread faster than I could correct it, as if I had been rewritten into someone they did not want to know. And I tried, I really did. I sent letters, I reached out through mutual friends, I even showed up once more during Thanksgiving thinking maybe the timing would soften something. But the door stayed closed that time too, and eventually I stopped trying, not because I gave up, but because I finally understood that there was nothing left to fix, because you cannot prove the truth to people who have already decided it does not matter. And that realization did something to me, something quiet but permanent. It forced me to build a life that did not include them, a life where I did not wait for permission to exist, and I poured everything I had into becoming someone they could not ignore, even if they never saw it, even if they never cared. But what I did not realize then, what I could not have predicted sitting alone in that car at the edge of their driveway, was that the same people who closed that door on me would one day be the ones waiting outside another set of doors, hoping I would open them. And when that moment came, everything they believed about me would be tested in a way none of us could. Walk away from the first year without them felt quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, just empty in a way that made even small moments echo louder than they should, like the sound of my own footsteps in my apartment at 2 in the morning, or the hum of the refrigerator when I could not sleep. And I told myself it was temporary, that once the truth came out, once Olivia slipped or someone asked the right question, everything would correct itself. But weeks turned into months and months turned into a full year. And nothing changed, no calls, no messages, no accidental reconnections, just silence that settled in like it had always been there. And that was when I stopped waiting. I went back to school that fall with a kind of focus I had never had before, not because I was motivated by success, but because I did not have anything else left to hold on to. And every hour I spent in the lab, every overnight shift, every exam I pushed through became something more than just progress. It became proof to myself that I still existed outside of what they believed about me. And there were moments when it almost worked, when I could go an entire day without thinking about them, when I could sit in a lecture hall or walk through the hospital corridors and feel like I belonged somewhere again. But then something small would pull me back, a classmate talking about calling their parents, a holiday decoration in a storefront window, a form that asked for emergency contact information, and I would pause, pen hovering, realizing there was no one left to write down. And those were the moments that hurt the most, not the big ones, not the night they closed the door, but the quiet reminders that I had been erased from a place that was supposed to be permanent. Olivia never reached out, not once, and that silence told me more than any apology ever could. It confirmed what I had started to understand that night in the driveway, that none of this had been an accident, that whatever story she told had been deliberate, calculated in a way I had been too naive to see before. And the more I thought about it, the more details started to click into place, the questions she asked, the way she listened, the timing of everything, and I realized I had handed her every piece she needed to build something convincing, something believable enough that my own parents would not even question it. And that realization changed something inside me, not into anger, not exactly, but into distance, a kind of emotional separation that made it easier to move forward because I no longer expected anything from them. By my 3rd year, I had stopped checking my phone out of habit, stopped wondering if today would be the day someone reached out, and instead I started building something new, relationships that were not tied to obligation or history, people who knew me as I was, Not as a version filtered through someone else's narrative, and it was not perfect, it was not the same, but it was real, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was choosing my place instead of waiting to be given one. And still there were nights when the past would catch up to me, when I would sit at my kitchen table with textbooks spread out and feel that old weight pressing in, the question I could never fully answer, why it had been so easy for them to let me go, why one lie had been enough to erase everything I had ever done. And I would replay that phone call, those 4 words, we saw the proof, over and over, trying to find the moment where I could have changed the outcome, the thing I could have said differently, but deep down I knew the truth, it would not have mattered because the decision had already been made long before that night. I just had not seen it clearly until it was too late, and by the time I graduated, standing in a crowded auditorium filled with families cheering and cameras flashing, I did not look for them anymore. I did not scan the audience hoping to catch a familiar face, because I already knew they would not be there. And that acceptance, as painful as it was, became something solid I could stand on, something that allowed me to keep moving forward without looking back. But what I did not realize then, as I walked off that stage and into the life I had built on my own, was that the past was not finished with me, that the story Olivia started was still unfolding in ways I had not yet seen, and that one day, without warning, it would pull me right back to the place I thought I had finally escaped. Residency started at 5:30 a.m. on a Monday that smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic, the kind of morning where everything moves faster than you can think and no one has time to ask where you came from or who you used to be. And that was exactly what I needed, a place where my past did not follow me through the doors, where I was not someone's daughter or someone's disappointment, just another doctor in training trying to keep up with the pace of a system that never slowed down for anyone. And in those first few months I learned how to function on 4 hours of sleep, how to make decisions with incomplete information, how to carry responsibility that felt heavier than anything I had ever known. And somewhere in that constant pressure, something inside me settled, not healed, but reshaped into something stronger, something quieter, something that did not need validation to keep going. There was a moment during my 2nd month, standing in a hallway just outside the nurse's station, when one of the attending physicians stopped me after a long shift and said, "You are steady under pressure." And it caught me off guard because no one had ever described me that way before, not my parents, not my teachers, not even myself, and I realized then that the version of me they had believed in, the one Olivia had painted so easily, was not the only version that existed, it was just the one they chose to see, and that distinction mattered more than I thought it would. I stopped trying to imagine what they would think of me now, stopped wondering if this version of me would have been enough to change their minds, because that question no longer controlled me the way it used to, and instead I focused on the life in front of me, the patients who needed attention, the cases that demanded clarity, the small moments where I could make a difference without anyone needing to know my history, and slowly, almost without noticing, I built something that felt real, something that belonged entirely to me. But even in that new life, there were shadows that never fully disappeared, habits that stayed long after they stopped making sense, like checking my phone at the end of a long shift even though I knew there would be no missed calls from them, or hesitating for a split second when someone asked about my family before giving a vague answer and moving the conversation forward, and I told myself it did not matter, that I had moved on, that the distance was permanent, but deep down there was always a part of me that wondered how long it would stay that way, how long before something pulled those two worlds back together again. The answer came on a Thursday afternoon, halfway through a double shift, when my pager went off with a number I did not recognize. And at first I almost ignored it, assuming it was just another consult, another routine interruption in a day full of them, but something about the sequence of numbers made me pause, something faintly familiar in a way I could not immediately place, and when I called it back expecting a colleague or a department request, the voice on the other end did not belong to anyone I worked with, it was my mother, and for a moment, I did not respond, not because I did not recognize her, but because hearing her voice after 5 years felt like stepping into a version of my life I had already left behind, like opening a door I had closed for good. And she did not say my name right away, she just inhaled sharply like she was not sure where to begin, and when she finally spoke, her words were not what I expected. There was no apology, no explanation, just urgency. "Emily, we need you." And those 4 words echoed in a way that made everything else in the room fade out, because for 5 years, they had not needed me at all, they had lived their lives without me, built their version of the truth without ever questioning it, and now suddenly without warning that had changed. And as I stood there, holding the phone, the noise of the hospital moving around me, I realized that whatever had happened, Whatever had brought her to call me after all this time was big enough to break through 5 years of silence, and I did not yet know what that meant, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: nothing about this call was going to be simple, and whatever came next was going to force all of us to face something we had been avoiding for a very long time. I did not answer her right away, not because I did not hear her, but because those 4 words did not fit into anything I understood about our relationship anymore. We need you. They had not needed me when I stood outside their door asking to be heard. They had not needed me when I graduated without them. They had not needed me for 5 years of silence that felt permanent. And yet here she was, saying it like it had always been true, like nothing had happened, and for a moment I almost said no, almost ended the call and returned to the life I had built without them. But something in her voice stopped me, something unsteady, something I had never heard from her before, and it was not guilt, not exactly, it was fear. What happened? I asked, my voice quieter than I expected, and there was a pause on the other end, the kind that stretches just long enough to tell you the answer is not simple. It is Olivia, she said finally, and hearing my sister's name after all this time felt strange, like a word I had not used in years, something that belonged to a different version of my life. She is at the hospital, my mother continued. They said they need a specialist, and someone told us you are here. And there it was, the reason behind the call: not reconciliation, not regret, just necessity, just the fact that I had become useful in a way they could not ignore. And I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not satisfaction, just clarity, because for the first time everything made sense. Without needing explanation, they had not called because they missed me. They had called because they had no other option. I glanced down the hallway, watching nurses move quickly between rooms, hearing the distant rhythm of monitors and voices layered over one another. The world I had spent years becoming part of continuing without pause, and I realized I was standing between 2 versions of myself, the one who had been left behind and the one who had moved forward, and for a second I did not know which one would answer. "Where are you?" I asked, keeping my tone steady, professional, the way I would speak to any other call. And my mother gave me the hospital name, the department, details I already knew because I was there, because the place she was describing was the same building I was standing in, just a different floor, and the realization hit me in a way that made everything feel closer, more immediate. "Stay there," I said, before she could say anything else, and I ended the call without waiting for a response. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have, each floor passing with a soft chime that echoed louder than usual, and I watched the numbers change. Without really seeing them, my mind pulling in 2 directions at once, one part focused on the practical details, the protocols, the expectations of the role I had trained for, and the other part replaying fragments of the past, the door closing, the silence, the years that followed, and I wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to see them again, not in memory, not in imagination, but standing right in front of me after everything that had happened. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a hallway I knew well, the lighting too bright, the air carrying that familiar sterile scent, and at the far end I saw them, my mother and father, standing side by side, looking smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in a way that is hard to explain, like the distance of 5 years had changed how I saw them, and for a moment none of us moved, none of us spoke, because there was too much between us to fit into a single second. And then my mother looked up, her eyes locking onto mine, and I saw it again, that same unsteady expression I had heard in her voice, and my father followed her gaze, his posture stiff, controlled, but different in a way I could not quite name. And I realized then that this was not just another moment, not just another interaction. This was the point where everything we had avoided was about to collide. And as I took the first step toward them, I understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever happened next was not going to change the past, but it was going to reveal something neither of them had been prepared to face. The distance between us closed in a matter of seconds, but it felt like crossing 5 years in slow motion, each step pulling memories back to the surface that I had spent so long learning how to quiet. And when I finally stopped in front of them, no one spoke right away, because there was no version of this moment that felt natural, not after everything that had happened, not after everything that had not been said. And for a second I thought my father might start, that he would say something controlled and measured the way he always did, but he did not. He just stood there looking at me like he was trying to place me into a version of the past that no longer existed. And it was my mother who broke the silence, her voice softer than I remembered. "Emily," she said again, and this time it sounded less certain, like she was not sure she had the right to use my name anymore. And I nodded once, not out of warmth, not out of reconciliation, just acknowledgement, just enough to move the moment forward. "Where is she?" I asked, keeping my tone steady, professional, the same tone I would use with anyone else in this hallway, and I saw something flicker across my father's face at that. Something subtle but unmistakable, because for the first time, I was not speaking to him as his daughter. I was speaking as someone he needed, and that shift mattered more than anything either of us could say out loud. My mother gestured down the hall, explaining quickly, words overlapping in a way that told me she was nervous, that she was trying to fill the silence with details, test results, timelines, names of doctors, but I was only half listening because I was already processing what I needed to know, already shifting into the part of me that had nothing to do with them, the part that made decisions based on facts instead of emotion, and as she spoke, I caught fragments of something else beneath the surface, something she was not saying directly, something about how this situation had escalated faster than they expected, how none of the options they had counted on were working, and that realization settled into place with a kind of quiet certainty. This was not just a difficult moment for them, this was a moment they could not control, and that was new. We reached the door together, and for a second my mother hesitated, her hand hovering near the handle like she was waiting for permission, like she needed me to confirm that I would step inside. And I did not say anything, I just moved past her and opened it myself, because that was the role I held here, not theirs, and as I stepped into the room, everything narrowed into focus the way it always did when I was working, the sounds, the equipment, the layout, all of it familiar in a way that grounded me instantly. And there, lying in the bed, was Olivia, and seeing her after 5 years was not what I expected, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just strange, like seeing someone from an old photograph suddenly placed into the present. And for a brief moment I did not feel anger or resentment, I just felt distance, the kind that comes from realizing how much time has passed and how much of it happened without them. I moved closer, checking details, reading charts, asking questions to the staff already there, slipping fully into the role I had trained for, and no one in the room treated me like anything other than what I was, a doctor responsible for the next decision. And that mattered because it meant this moment was not about the past, not yet, it was about what needed to happen now, and behind me I could feel my parents watching, waiting, trying to understand what this version of me meant, how it fit into the story they had believed for so long, and I knew without turning around that they were seeing something they had never allowed themselves to see before, not because I was explaining it, not because I was defending myself, but because it was right in front of them, undeniable in a way no argument could ever be. And as I finished reviewing everything and stepped back, I understood something that had been building since the moment my mother called. This was not just about helping Olivia. This was about confronting the gap between who they thought I was and who I had become, and there was no way for them to avoid it anymore, because for the first time in 5 years, they were not the ones deciding what happened next. I was. For a moment, no one said anything, and that silence felt heavier than anything that had come before. Because it was not filled with accusations or explanations, it was filled with something unfamiliar, uncertainty, and I could feel it in the way my mother shifted slightly behind me, in the way my father cleared his throat but did not speak, like they were waiting for me to define what this moment meant, and that was new because they had never waited for me before. I finished reviewing the chart and turned slightly toward the nurse, asking a few precise questions, confirming details, making decisions the way I had been trained to do, each step deliberate, controlled, grounded in the present instead of the past, and I could sense my parents watching every movement, trying to reconcile this version of me with the one they had dismissed so easily, and I wondered briefly if they could see it now, if they could see how wrong they had been, but I did not ask because I did not need the answer anymore. When I stepped back from the bedside, my mother moved closer, her voice low, hesitant. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked, and it was such a simple question, the kind any parent would ask, but coming from her after everything, it carried something else underneath it, something like vulnerability, something like dependence, and I met her gaze for a second before answering, choosing my words carefully, not to soften the truth but not to make it harder than it needed to be. "She is stable right now, but there are complications we need to monitor closely," I said, keeping my tone even, and I saw the way my father reacted to that, the way his shoulders shifted just slightly, as if he was trying to process a situation he could not control with logic alone, and that was when he finally spoke, his voice measured, but no longer distant. "What do you need?" he asked, and the question hung in the air between us because it was not just about Olivia, it was about the shift that had taken place, the recognition that I was no longer someone they could dismiss, that I was now the one holding information, holding decisions, holding something they needed. I turned back to the chart for a second, giving myself time, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood the weight of what was happening. Here, the way this moment was rewriting something that had been fixed in their minds for years, and when I spoke again it was clear, direct, professional. I need you to trust the process, to follow the instructions we give you, and to understand that this is not something you can control. And I watched as those words settled in, as they realized what they meant, because for people like my parents, control had always been the foundation of everything, the way they measured value, the way they made decisions, and now, standing in this room, they were being asked to let go of it, to rely on someone they had once refused to believe. My mother nodded, first quickly, almost too quickly, like she was eager to agree, eager to hold on to anything that might stabilize the situation. But my father took a second longer, his eyes fixed on me in a way that felt different from before, less certain, more searching, and I could see the question forming there, the one he had not asked yet, the one he might not even know how to ask. How did we get this wrong? How did we not see this? And for a brief moment I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not forgiveness, just awareness, because this was the first time he had ever looked at me without already knowing who I was supposed to be. I turned away before that moment could stretch into something else, focusing back on the work in front of me, because that was the only place where everything made sense, where roles were clear and outcomes depended on action instead of history. And as I moved to coordinate the next steps, I realized something that had not been fully clear until now. This situation was not just forcing them to see me differently, it was forcing me to see them differently too, not as the fixed figures from my past, but as people standing in a moment they did not understand, trying to navigate something they could not control. And that realization did not change what had happened, it did not erase the years or the silence, but it did shift the way this moment felt, because for the first time, we were not standing on opposite sides of a decision, we were standing in the same uncertainty, and neither of us knew exactly what would come next. The next few hours blurred into a rhythm I knew well, updates, observations, adjustments, decisions made in careful steps instead of sudden moves. And I stayed focused on that rhythm because it was the only place where everything made sense, where outcomes followed logic instead of emotion. But every time I stepped out into the hallway, I could feel it again, the weight of their presence, the way my parents sat just outside the room, quieter than I had ever seen them, like they were afraid to disrupt something they did not fully understand. And it struck me how different they looked from the people I remembered, not older, not weaker, just smaller in a way that came from uncertainty, from not knowing what to do next. At one point my mother stood when I approached, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Is there anything we should be doing?" she asked, and I recognized the tone immediately. It was the same one she used when speaking to authority figures, polite, careful, deferential, and it took me a second to realize she was using it with me. And that realization settled in quietly, without triumph, without satisfaction, just a shift in perspective. Because this was not the power I had imagined wanting when I was younger. This was something else entirely, something more complicated. And I answered her the same way I would answer anyone in her position, clearly, calmly, without personal history attached. "Just stay available, we will let you know if anything changes." And she nodded, stepping back slightly, as if she did not want to get in the way, and for a brief moment, I saw the contrast so clearly it almost felt unreal. The same woman who once stood between me and the door now standing back, waiting for my direction. My father remained seated, but his attention followed every movement, every word, and when our eyes met, there was something there that had not been there before, not control, not certainty, but something closer to recognition, like he was seeing the full picture for the first time and realizing how incomplete it had been before. And he did not say anything, not yet, but I could tell he was thinking, measuring, recalibrating the way he always did, except this time the variables were different because I was one of them. As the afternoon shifted into evening, the pace slowed slightly, enough for space to open between moments, and it was in that space that the past started pressing in again, not as sharply as before, but present enough that I could not ignore it completely, and I found myself watching them from a distance, noticing small things I had not paid attention to before. The way my mother checked her phone even though no new information had come in. The way my father adjusted his posture every few minutes like he was trying to stay composed in a situation that refused to follow his expectations. And I wondered, not for the first time, if they were thinking about that night too, if they were replaying it the way I had, if they were starting to see it differently now that the roles had shifted. Later, when I returned with another update, my father finally spoke again. His voice quieter than before. "Emily," he said, and there was a pause after my name, a hesitation that felt unfamiliar coming from him. "About what happened before." He began, and for a second everything in me went still, because this was the moment I had imagined so many times, the beginning of an explanation, an acknowledgement, something that might make sense of the past, but he did not finish the sentence. He stopped as if he did not know how to continue, as if the words he had relied on his entire life were no longer enough to carry what he needed to say. And I realized then that this was not going to be simple, not for him, not for any of us, because admitting the truth would mean unraveling something they had held on to for years, and that kind of shift does not happen in a single conversation. It happens slowly, piece by piece, if it happens at all. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, not inviting him to continue, not shutting him down either, just acknowledging that the conversation existed now, that it could not be ignored forever, and then I stepped back into the room, returning to the place where everything was clear again, where actions mattered more than words. But as I moved, I carried that unfinished sentence with me, because something had changed, something subtle, but undeniable. The certainty that defined our past was starting to crack, and what would come through those cracks next was something none of us could fully predict. The night stretched longer than it should have, the kind of slow, heavy passage of time where every minute feels deliberate, like the world is waiting for something to shift, and I stayed in motion to keep from thinking too much, moving between rooms, checking updates, speaking with staff, maintaining the rhythm that kept everything grounded in the present. But even within that rhythm, I could feel it building, the tension that had nothing to do with the medical situation and everything to do with what had been left unresolved for 5 years, because now there was no distance to hide behind, no silence to protect us from it. Sometime after midnight, I stepped out into the hallway again, and my parents were still there, exactly where I had left them, my mother sitting with her hands folded tightly in her lap, my father standing nearby, his posture straighter than necessary, like he was holding himself together through structure alone. And when they saw me, they both stood at the same time, almost instinctively, and for a moment, it felt like stepping into a memory that had been altered just enough to feel unfamiliar. Because this was not how it used to be. They did not used to stand when I approached. They did not used to look at me like they were waiting for direction. "Any changes?" my father asked, his voice steady but lower than before, and I gave him a brief update, clear and measured, nothing more than what was necessary, and he listened without interrupting, without questioning, absorbing the information in a way that felt different from the man I remembered. And when I finished, there was a pause, a quiet space where something else could be said, something that had nothing to do with the situation in the room behind me, and this time he did not let it pass. "Emily," he said again, and I could hear the effort in it now, the way he was choosing each word instead of relying on certainty. "We may have misunderstood some things," and it was not an apology, not directly, but it was the closest he had come so far, and I felt that shift more than I expected. Not as relief, not as closure, but as something fragile. Something that could either build into something real or collapse under the weight of everything that had come before. My mother looked at him when he said it, her expression changing slightly, like she had been waiting for him to speak first, and then she added more quietly, "We should have listened." And those words landed differently because they acknowledged something specific, not just the outcome but the process, the choice they had made to believe one voice over another. And for a second I did not respond, not because I did not hear them, but because I did not know what response would be honest, what response would not either dismiss the past or pretend it had not mattered. And I realized in that moment that this was not going to be resolved in a single exchange, that even if they said everything I had once wanted to hear, it would not erase the years that had already passed. I looked at them both, really looked this time, taking in the details I had avoided before, the lines that had deepened, the tension they were no longer hiding, the uncertainty that had replaced their certainty, and I understood something I had not fully allowed myself to see. They were not just confronting what had happened to me, they were confronting what their choices had revealed about themselves, and that was a different kind of weight, one that could not be explained away or corrected quickly. "Right now," I said finally, keeping my voice steady, grounded in the present. "What matters is her condition." And it was not avoidance, not entirely, but it was a boundary, a way of acknowledging that this moment was not just about them, not just about what they were ready to say, but about something that required my full attention. And they both nodded, accepting that, perhaps understanding it more than they would have before. And as I turned to go back inside, I felt the shift settle more clearly into place, not complete, not resolved, but undeniable, because the story they had believed for 5 years was starting to unravel, piece by piece, and for the first time, they were the ones trying to understand what the truth might actually look like, and what they would have to face once they saw it. By early morning, the hospital had settled into that strange in-between state where everything is quieter but nothing has truly slowed down, the overhead lights still bright, the footsteps still steady, but the urgency softened just enough to make room for thoughts you have been pushing away. And I found myself standing at the edge of the nurse's station, reviewing notes that I had already reviewed twice, not because I needed to, but because it gave me something to focus on that was not them, that was not the conversation waiting just outside the room, because even though I had kept everything contained so far, I knew that moment was coming, the one where this would stop being just about Olivia's condition and start being about everything that had been left unsaid for 5 years. When I stepped back into the hallway, my parents were still there, but something about them had shifted again, not in posture this time but in presence, like the weight of the night had worn down whatever distance they had been holding on to, and my mother stood as soon as she saw me, her expression searching, hesitant, while my father remained seated, his hands clasped together in a way that felt unfamiliar, like he was holding on to something he could not quite control, and for a moment none of us spoke because there was no longer anything to hide behind, not the urgency, not the uncertainty, not even the silence. It was my mother who spoke first, her voice softer than before, almost careful. "Emily, can we talk?" And the words felt simple, but they carried something heavier underneath them, something that acknowledged this was not just another update, not just another question about what was happening inside that room. And I hesitated for a second, not because I did not expect this, but because I understood what it meant, that once we started this conversation, there would be no easy way to step back from it, no way to keep the past contained in the way I had been managing all night. And still I nodded because avoiding it now would not change anything. We moved a few steps down the hallway, far enough to create space, not far enough to pretend we were somewhere else, and my father stood this time facing me directly, and I could see it clearly now. The shift that had been building since the moment I walked in, the absence of certainty, the presence of something else, something closer to doubt, and he exhaled slowly before speaking, like he was choosing his words carefully in a way I had never seen before. "We believed what Olivia told us," he said, and it was not defensive, not justified, just stated plainly, and for a second I felt that familiar pull, the one that wanted to explain, to correct, to go back through everything point by point, but I did not move toward it because I had already done that once 5 years ago, and I knew how it ended. "I know," I said instead, keeping my voice even, and he nodded slightly as if that response confirmed something for him, and then he continued, "She showed us messages, things that looked real, things that made sense at the time." And there was a pause there, a shift in his tone, "But we never asked you." And that was it, that was the part that landed, not the lie, not the misunderstanding, but the choice, the decision to accept one version of the story without ever questioning it. And I felt that settle into place more clearly than anything else he had said so far, because it was the first time he had acknowledged the part that mattered. My mother stepped closer then, her voice quieter, almost unsteady. "We thought we were protecting the family," she said, and I looked at her for a second, really looked, trying to understand how that reasoning had made sense to her, how it had justified closing the door, blocking the calls, erasing me so completely, and I realized something then that I had not fully seen before. They had not just believed Olivia, they had believed the version of me that made Olivia's story possible, the version they had carried for years without ever questioning it, and that was not something a single conversation could undo. "You did not protect anything," I said, not harsh, not raised, just clear, and both of them went still at that, because there was no anger in my voice to push back against, no emotion to deflect, just a statement that stood on its own, and for a moment none of us spoke again because there was nothing simple left to say, nothing that could tie this into a clean resolution. And as I stood there with them, I understood something that had been building all night. This was not the moment where everything would be fixed. This was the moment where everything would finally be seen for what it was, and once that happened, there would be no going back to the version of the story they had believed for so long. For a long moment after I said it, neither of them responded, and the silence that followed felt different from before, not uncertain, not hesitant, but heavy in a way that meant something had finally landed, something that could not be explained away or reshaped into something easier to accept, and I watched it register in their expressions, the way my mother's shoulders dropped slightly, the way my father's gaze shifted downward for just a second before returning to me, like he was recalibrating again, but this time without the same confidence he had always relied on. "You are right," my mother said quietly, and the words came out slower than anything she had said, so far like she was not just speaking to me but to herself as well, and I could see the effort it took, the way she had to move through something internally before those words could exist out loud. And for a second I did not react, not because I did not hear her, but because I did not know what to do with it, because hearing someone admit that does not undo the years that came before it. It does not return the moments that were missed or the versions of myself that were erased, it just changes the shape of the present. My father exhaled slowly, his posture shifting again, less rigid now, less controlled, and when he spoke, his voice carried something I had never heard from him before, something closer to uncertainty than authority. "We should have asked you," he said, repeating it more clearly this time, as if saying it again made it more real. And I nodded once, not as agreement, not as acceptance, just acknowledgement, because that was the truth and there was nothing else to add to it. For a moment it felt like the conversation might continue, like there might be more explanations, more attempts to piece together what had happened, but instead something else surfaced, something quieter, and my mother stepped closer again, her voice almost hesitant. "Why did you not come back?" she asked, and the question caught me off guard, not because I did not understand it, but because of what it revealed, because it suggested that part of her had expected me to keep trying, to keep knocking on that door even after it had been closed, and I felt something shift inside me at that, something sharper than before, not anger exactly, but clarity, and I held her gaze as I answered. "I did," I said. Simply, and for a second she looked confused, like the answer did not match what she remembered, and I continued, still calm, still steady. "I called, I sent messages, I came to the house more than once." And I saw it then, the realization spreading across her face, the way the timeline she had been holding on to no longer aligned with what I was saying, because whatever version of events Olivia had given them had not included that part. Had not included the attempts, the effort, the time I had spent trying to fix something that they had already decided was broken. And my father's expression changed as well, more sharply this time, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he was replaying something in his mind, searching for details that had been missing before. "She told us you disappeared," he said, almost to himself, and that was it. That was the moment where the story started to fracture, not just in theory, but in something concrete, something they could not ignore, because now there were two versions of the same events, and they could not both be true, and for the first time, they were forced to consider that the one they had believed so completely might not hold up under closer examination. I did not push further, I did not list every message, every attempt, every unanswered call, because I did not need to. The doubt was already there, already growing, and I understood that this was not something I needed to prove anymore, not the way I had 5 years ago, because the situation itself was doing that work now, revealing inconsistencies, exposing gaps, forcing them to look at something they had accepted without question before. We stood there for another second, the air between us shifting again, less defined, less certain, and I could see it clearly now. The foundation of what they had believed was no longer stable. It was starting to give way under the weight of new information, and as that happened, something else became inevitable, the question they had not asked yet, the one that would follow once they fully understood what had been taken from me and how easily they had allowed it to happen. And as I turned slightly back toward the room, preparing to return to the part of this situation I could control, I knew that question was coming, and when it did, it would not just change how they saw the past, it would change how they saw Olivia. And that was something none of us were fully prepared for. The shift happened quietly, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the way both of them went still after my father spoke, as if something inside their understanding had finally broken open, and I could see it in their faces, not just doubt now, but the beginning of something heavier, something closer to realization, because if what I said was true, if I had reached out and they had never known, then it meant one thing they had not yet fully allowed themselves to consider, that Olivia had not just misrepresented the situation, she had controlled it. My father straightened slightly, but the movement lacked the certainty it once had, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. "Why would she say that?" he asked, not looking at me directly at first, as if the question itself was difficult to hold. And I understood immediately what he was really asking, not just about Olivia, but about everything that had led to this point, everything that no longer fit into the version of reality they had been operating under. And for a moment I considered answering, laying out the pattern, the history, the small details that had built up over years, but I stopped myself because this was not something I needed to explain for them anymore. This was something they needed to see on their own. "I do not know," I said instead, and it was the truth, at least the part of the truth that mattered now, because understanding Olivia's reasons would not change what had happened, would not return the years or repair the decisions that had already been made. And I saw the impact of that answer in the way my mother's expression shifted, the way her eyes moved slightly as if she was searching for something that was no longer there, something stable, something certain. We trusted her, she said, almost to herself, and the weight of that statement settled between us, because it was not just about trust, it was about where that trust had been placed, and where it had not, and I could see her beginning to trace that line backward, to reconsider moments she had not questioned before. Conversation she had accepted without doubt, and that process was not immediate, not clean, but it had started, and once it starts, it does not stop easily. My father turned toward the door of the room then, his gaze fixed on it in a way that felt different from earlier, not just concern now, but something more complicated, something that suggested he was seeing Olivia not just as the person inside that room, but as the person who had shaped everything that came after that night. And for the first time I saw hesitation there, not about her condition, but about what he believed about her, and that hesitation mattered because it meant the certainty he had relied on was no longer intact. We should have verified it, he said more firmly this time, as if grounding himself in that conclusion, and I nodded slightly because that was part of it but not all of it, and I knew he was starting to understand that too, that this was not just a failure of information, it was a failure of judgment, a failure to question something that aligned too easily with what they already believed. There was a long pause after that, longer than any we had shared so far. And in that pause I could feel the shift becoming something more solid. Something that would not simply fade once this moment passed, because they were no longer just reacting to what I was saying, they were starting to reconstruct the past in a different way, piece by piece, and that process would lead them somewhere they had not expected, somewhere that would force them to confront not just what Olivia had done, but what they had allowed. Emily, my mother said again, her voice quieter now, almost careful, we did not know. And I looked at her for a second, really looked, taking in the sincerity, the regret that was beginning to surface, and I believed her, at least in that moment, but belief did not change the outcome, it did not undo the years, and I felt that distinction clearly as I answered, I know. Because that was the truth they had not known, but they had chosen not to know, and that difference mattered more than anything else. I turned slightly then, shifting my attention back toward the room, because the present still required it, still demanded focus, and as I did, I realized something with a clarity that had not been there before. This was no longer about proving anything, no longer about defending myself or correcting their version of events. That part was over. What remained was something else entirely, something that would unfold whether I participated in it or not, because once the foundation of what they believed had been shaken, everything built on top of it would have to be reconsidered. And as I stepped back toward the door, I understood that the next part of this was not mine to control, it was theirs, and whatever they chose to do with that realization would define what came after this moment in a way none of us could yet predict. By the time the morning light started filtering through the narrow windows at the end of the hallway, everything had shifted into a quieter kind of clarity, not resolution, not closure, but something steadier, something that did not need to be forced into a conclusion to feel real. And I found myself standing just outside Olivia's room again, watching the steady rhythm of the monitors, the small movements that signaled stability, and for the first time since my mother's call, I allowed myself to step back from the urgency of it all and see the full picture as it was now, not as it had been 5 years ago, not as it had been shaped by someone else's version of events, but as it existed in this moment, with all of us standing inside it whether we were ready or not. Behind me my parents were still there, but they were no longer waiting in the same way, no longer holding on to the same expectations, and I could feel that difference without turning around, the absence of control, the presence of something quieter, something more uncertain but also more honest. And when I finally did turn, I saw it clearly in their faces. The way they looked at me now was not defined by comparison or assumption, it was defined by recognition, not complete, not fully formed but undeniable, and that mattered more than anything they could say. My mother stepped forward slightly, her movements slower, more deliberate, as if she was aware that this moment required something different from anything she had done before. Thank you, she said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight in a way I had not expected because they were not about obligation or expectation, they were about acknowledgement, about seeing something they had not seen before, and I nodded once, accepting it without adding anything because there was nothing to add, not yet, not in a way that would not rush something that needed time. My father followed a second later, his gaze steady, no longer searching in the same way but still processing, still adjusting to something that did not fit into the structure he had relied on for so long. We will need to talk, he said, and there was no assumption in it, no expectation that I would agree, just a statement of what he understood now, that there were things left unresolved, things that could not be ignored any longer, and I considered that for a moment, not the conversation itself but what it would mean to have it what it would require from all of us, and I realized something then that I had not fully allowed myself to consider before, that moving forward did not mean returning to what had been. It meant deciding what could exist now, if anything, and that decision would not be made in a single conversation or a single moment. Maybe, I said, and it was. Not a refusal, not an acceptance, just an honest answer that reflected where I stood, and they both seemed to understand that, because neither of them pushed, neither of them tried to fill the space with more words, and that, more than anything else, showed me how much had already changed. I turned back toward the room then, toward the part of this that I could control, the part that did not depend on history or belief or anything that had come before, and as I stepped inside, I felt that sense of separation more clearly than ever, not distance in the way it had been before, not isolation but distinction, the understanding that who I was now did not belong to the version of me they had once dismissed, and that understanding was not something they had given me, it was something I had built on my own, piece by piece, over the years they had not been there. I checked everything one more time, confirmed what needed to be confirmed, and when I stepped back again, I paused for just a second, looking at Olivia not as the person who had shaped those 5 years, but as someone who was now part of a moment that none of us could undo, and I realized that whatever came next, whatever decisions were made, whatever conversations followed, would not change what had already happened, but they would define what came after, and that was something I could choose to be part of or not. As I walked out of the room again, the hallway felt different than it had the night before, not because the situation had changed dramatically, but because the weight of it had shifted from something unresolved and distant to something present and undeniable. And as I passed my parents, meeting their eyes briefly before continuing forward, I understood one final thing with complete clarity. They had spent 5 years believing I was someone I was not, and now for the first time they were seeing me as I actually was, but what they did with that truth, and whether it would ever be enough to rebuild anything between us, was no longer something I needed to prove, it was something they would have to earn.